Anyway, so I got to sort of got to know Tim because I had heard from a friend of mine, guy who's in my congregation in Preston, who went on a trip to the Grand Canyon with Steve Austin and Dan Ingram, and we had a great trip. But he'd gone to the Creation Research Society, heard Tim talk about a specific issue where there's some slight disagreement in the geology and timing. I don't know if he's going to talk about that. That gets into some really technical stuff. But anyway, so when I asked John Baumgartner about it, he copied his reply to Tim, and so we got in contact, and I read about him on the ICR website, and I thought, well, we had another opportunity to have somebody speak on creation and the flood, and so I thought this would be great to have Tim come and join us, and it all worked out, and the technology worked out. So I'm going to just turn it over to him and have him also tell us a little bit about the new ICR museum that they're working feverishly at to get it online for September 2nd. So take it
That's
away,
correct.
Tim.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we got the technology to work too, since I'm a little technologically challenged at times. I'm a geologist, but the technology keeps moving so fast I can't keep up. But anyway, at ICR, I've been with them for a little over 6 years now, and I've been taking over kind of the geology role that Steve Austin used to do. And Steve and I are pretty good friends from quite a ways back. Even before I kind of jumped into the creation world, I was at a secular college for about 17 years. Before that, I was with Chevron, and I bounced around the oil field for about eight and a half years, and so a lot of that I'm actually using. I see God's hand now in my sort of training in my early years of my career to do the research that I'm doing now to show the evidence of the flood. But what we're trying to start at ICR is we're about to open our Discovery Center, or our museum, if you want to call it that, here in Dallas. It's the very northwest corner of Dallas. And so it's you cross the road to the west and the north, and you're in a different city. But it's just south of 635 on Luna Road, about a mile south of 635, if you're familiar with the Dallas metro area. So we're almost in Irving, almost in Farmers Branch, but we're right in the corner of Dallas. And I was trying to find out from some of my colleagues how many square feet are in our museum, but I don't really know. Nobody's written me back. But it's pretty sizable, and we've spent about $37 million on it, and a lot of it's the technology that we're trying to portray to show that science really does confirm the Bible. And much of there's going to be these screens. They're done by people that work for Disney World or Universal Studios. They're making things really come on, kind of technologically kind of pop, make it very attractive for the people that come through. And lots of animatronic dinosaurs, a full-size Tyrannosaurus Rex that growls and roars and winks and snarls at you, and a whole bunch of other little dinosaurs. And so it's going to kind of lead you through the creation week with some really spectacular show that you can see how God created everything in 6 literal days. And then going to move from there to you go and kind of through a little bit of the Garden of Eden thing, kind of show how where Adam and Eve sinned and where things took the fall, so to speak. And then you work your way out to eventually we kind of go right to the ark. We have a little miniature piece of the ark that you walk through, and you can look out the back and see the kind of the waves and things. But we've got a lot of animals in there that actually move as well. And then you come out of that to the post-flood. Well, in that flood room, there's going to be a big globe, which I'll talk about later in my talk. 48-inch globe that's going to show the flood in about a 2-minute video that projects onto this globe, using a lot of the research that I've compiled in the last 6 years to show what the pre-flood world looked like, kind of the general highs and lows, and then how it moved through catastrophic plate tectonics, like John Baumgartner has talked about, probably you might have heard about, very quickly during the flood, and then how the Earth recovered, and it kind of shows all that in about 2 minutes time. So I'll show a little bit of that later in my talk, at least on a flat screen. And then you come out of there, there's a large Grand Canyon exhibit that I helped the carver get the carving just right for all the different rock layers they're trying to show up and down, and make some real good geologic points that shows the lack of erosion between layers. It shows all these different features, and there's going to be highlights again. You can highlight those different things. Then you come through there, and there's a lot of post-flood evidence of dinosaurs. There's a lot of evidence of that's where a lot of the animatronics are as well. And then eventually there's a Mount St. Helens exhibit at the end of that room. And so there's a huge mock-up of Mount St. Helens that kind of talks about how we have witnessed since the 1980 eruption, the rapid sedimentation, rapid erosion, all the things that the flood did, but we can see it on a smaller scale happen even today. And then there's an ice age room where you walk into this theater that's going to be about 10 degrees cooler, and there's a 7-minute video to watch to learn about the ice age and the cause of the ice age and how it was tied to the flood. And eventually it goes into, there's a little Life of Christ exhibit with an empty tomb. And finally there's a 5-minute video, 5 or 7-minute video showing the little bit of the Christ story. Was done, Hollywood quality video that's almost like a 3D thing. It's going to show the return of Christ and end with, all of this, the creation, the fall, the flood, the judgment of the flood. All these things all ends up pointing to Christ, that Christ was there throughout, and he's offered us salvation, through his shed blood on the cross. And so the whole thing hopefully will point to Christ, and people that are unbelievers may, have something to think about when they come out, that maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is a lot of science that does, in fact, support the Bible that you don't hear about in the public schools. And so it should really be a real strengthening facility for believers to show them there really is a lot of evidence that shows the Bible's true. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. Is my presentation. There a lot of my research I've been doing. I'm trying to pare it down. If you don't get it all, that's okay. The point of it all is there really was a global flood, and the rocks really do show the evidence of a global flood. And hopefully that's the one point that you'll take away from this when it's all said and done. We're going to start with my co-author here, Davis J. Warner. He's actually a student, and that's not his real name because we don't want to really out his name just in case people start Googling things. We don't want, until he gets his graduate degrees, we like to kind of keep him. Steve Austin did that as well for many years till he got his PhD. And it's probably a good tactic. It's sad we have to do that, but he's actually helps me a lot with the maps, and I can't do it without him. And he's becoming a more integral part of this. And so I'm glad he's been taking his time getting his undergraduate. He's working on his geology degree. Eventually he wants to get graduate degrees in geology, and hopefully he'll go into creation science. We do need more scientists going into this. And we need more pastors behind us. So I'm glad you guys are here to listen in. So we'll move along. The question about the flood is a lot of people doubt there was a global flood. They think it was local. They talk about it just one in the Middle East and that sort of thing. And I know even a lot of seminaries and Christian schools teach that as well. Many evangelical leaders, in fact, deny the flood. We can't even speak at many places. We call them and say, we're going to be in town for the CRS meeting, say in Wisconsin, like we just were. And suddenly they, oh no, that's too controversial. We don't want to, have anybody coming in, even though we're right there and it's virtually free. There's still a lot of churches that don't want to hear about it. And a lot of them are taught at the seminaries. And we've seen it about the old earth story, that we have to accept what science says. But science is not basing their interpretations on true science. They're basing it on more of their religion of pushing God out of the picture. And so there's a whole problem there. That's another whole talk on itself. We'll move along. You guys probably see it every day. A lot of your colleagues are old earth or young earth, and it's unfortunately not uniform in the Christian world. And they use this chart here, the whole idea of the fossil record to try to intimidate Christians and intimidate people and teach people this shows evolution. But really the fossils don't show evolution. They just show sudden appearances of things, and then they disappear, sudden appearance and disappear. And as you go throughout the whole column, if you look on the kind of on this side, I hope you can see my arrow, there's all these index fossils that are marine. So even though you've got dinosaurs like T-Rexes, you've got sharks being buried right in the same rock layers, 6 species of sharks with the T-Rexes. So there's all this marine influence that's out there. And I actually have a book coming out, hopefully by the end of the year, on the flood, detailing a lot of what I'm telling you guys today in greater detail, but it ties more things together. So if you follow the ICR website, you can see when that's going to come out, or get our Acts and Facts, you can see when that comes out. But there's a lot of mixing, and that's often neglected. They just try to show you the animals on the land, but they forget about all the dinosaurs being buried with marine fossils, etc., as you go through it. And as you guys know, in 2 Peter 3, it says there should come in the last days scoffers walk after their own lusts. People scoff at the idea of a global flood. And they're willingly ignorant, like it says in the Word of God, that the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So here we are, the New Testament, talking about the overflowing of the whole world, by a flood. That actually did happen. It's a historical, fact of the Bible that this actually happened. That people still deny it, and and Peter, through God's inspiration, wrote down that God knew there'd be scoffers in the last days who deny it. And the evolutionists, of course, deny the truth of God's word, where it says in Psalm and in John as well, John 17:17, that word is true from the beginning. It's not from Matthew to Revelation. It starts the very first book of the Bible in Genesis. The whole Bible is true from the very beginning. So we're going to look at three truths of the flood. We'll spend most of our time on the first one, which is the flood was global. That's kind of what my research is showing, that there really was a global flood. And secondly, we'll look at that it was catastrophic. It wasn't just a tranquil flood. It didn't just slowly fill up the bathtub. It was very catastrophic. A lot of fast-moving tsunami-like waves. And then finally, that it was a recent flood. It's just happened thousands of years ago, just like the Bible's genealogies show. Many of you pastors don't preach on the genealogies because the names are hard to pronounce, for one thing. But they're there to show that the flood and the creation wasn't that long ago. I think that's an important point, so we don't get all caught up in this evolution, because evolution needs time. For even if it could happen, which we don't believe it could. It's still, they hide behind that shroud of time. Millions of years, anything could happen. Well, even in millions of years, I don't believe it would ever happen, but that's beside the point. But anyway, the secular world believes in 6 floods, and they call these sequences or mega sequences. They've been named since the 60s. We've jumped up to mega sequences now because the terminology has gotten so complex. So this is kind of the biggest 6. These are the big 6, and they're supposed to have flooded. This is North America. They believe most of North America flooded early, and millions of years later there was another flood. Millions of years later there was another flood. Millions of years later another. Eventually you get through 6 floods. And they list them all over here on the side, these mega sequences on the far right side. I just numbered them 1 through 6 because it's easier. And the guy that named them, he named them in the U.S., so he used North American tribes of Native people, Native Indians, if you want to call them that, Native American people. So the Sauk, Tippecanoe, et cetera, all the way up. So I'll talk about some of these names, but kind of go by, we're going to look at these like as the chapters of the flood. And we don't believe all this millions of years over here. And I'm actually saying this isn't quite true either, that you didn't have real high sea level like we teach our geology students early in the Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian, and those sort of rock layers. Those really doesn't seem to be the case. It only peaks in one location up here towards the end of the flood. When you get to the day 150, I believe the Bible talks about where the flood peaked, and then it went down. And so we'll see later that the evidence doesn't support really what the secular scientists have said. But we'll go through these as chapters. Of course, the Sauk includes the Cambrian, the Cambrian explosion, the very first layers that show prolific fossils worldwide. It's for a reason, because that was the beginning really of the flood that was moving sediments across the land as we go. So again, just to make sure that's clear, we believe this all happened in the 1 year of the flood. Most of it probably in the first 314 days. Because on Genesis, I believe 8:13, it says Noah looked out and the earth was dry. And I think that's on day 314. So then they waited on the ark another 60 or so days for grass and vegetation to grow because there was nothing to eat. And so I think that's the reason why God made them wait a little longer. So they're on the ark just over a year if you count up the days. And when I started this project, I wanted to look at data. I said, what do the data really show? What do the rocks really show? And as a geologist, rocks are artifacts, our data, and fossils are artifacts. It's how they're interpreted. But I wanted to do science the way science is supposed to be done. Just look at the data and then come up with conclusions based on the data. Too much science today is now done by, we know the answer, let's go out and prove it. And that's kind of what the evolutionists do. They know we evolved because they don't want to believe there was a God. They don't want to believe God created, animals the way they, according to their kind, like he says in the Bible. So they have to come up with their own alternative theories. And so they know that we evolved, whether the evidence is there or not, but they go out to try to find it. But in this case, I just said, let's look at the rocks. Let's see what the rocks really show. Do we see evidence of a global flood or not? And I started compiling these columns. And this is one from my home state of Michigan. On the far left side here, you can see this is the sequences or mega sequences. This is the rocks I put them in meter by meter by meter. This is 5,000 meters in the middle of the Michigan Basin. I keep track of about 16 different rock types, more geology than you guys want to know. And then here's the mega sequences. Even an earlier one, this may be tied to the fountains of the Great Deep bursting, this late Precambrian. But I've got over 2,000 columns now globally. 4 continents are done. I'm working on Asia, the 5th continent, and then eventually I'll get to Australia and kind of work on the continents that matched up in what we believe, plate tectonics. You have that Pangea type thing, and we see that. And so I'm trying to work those first. And it's really compelling what we're going to see. And each column is like if you drilled a well right at where you're sitting, you drilled all the way down to the crust. What are the rocks that are there? And that's what I put in by latitude and longitude all over, 700 and some across North America and 400 or 500 across each continent. And a pretty good representation of what's happening in the world. But let's look at what the Bible says. And the Bible talks about the very first day of the flood. God shuts the door, and the fountains of the great deep burst open. It says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, while the fountains of the great deep broken, the windows of heaven were open. In Genesis 7. And we believe this is where the plates probably began. John Baumgartner talks about catastrophic plate tectonics, rapid moving plates. And he shows the geophysics that supports that. The math does support that would actually happen. And he's never been proven wrong. The secular or evolutionary world just chooses to ignore him. So I believe he's correct. His math is correct. There really was movement of these plates, but they had to start first. They had to break the plates up, and I think this is what the Bible is talking about here. The fountains of the deep in the oceans and on the land all around the world. And the Earth is the only planet in our solar system that has these moving plates, has these tectonic plates. And I think they started on the very first day of the flood and the fountains burst. So let's move on to chapters 1 to 3. And the early chapters are all pretty much similar. And I think this may be up to day 40, and I'll talk about why later of the flood, a little bit of implications. So it goes on and talks about the 40 days and 40 nights of rain. But unfortunately, many of my students, I teach part-time at Liberty online for Liberty University. And every time the question is asked, how long did the flood last? 90% of them say 40 days. So I don't know what's being taught in the churches anymore. But apparently 40 days is what's being taught. So there's a lesson to you guys there. And but it's 40 days of rain, but the flood went on a lot longer. And so, again, we talked about earlier, it went on almost a year before they got off the ark, over a year. The Sauk through Kaskaskia, Sauk Tippecanoe, New Kaskaskia, chapters 1 to 3, the early rock layers that contain mostly marine fossils, as we'll see. When the plates start to move, just like we see today, when the plates move, tsunamis are generated. And so tsunami waves started going across these more subdued continents that we had in the pre-flood world. We didn't have the big mountains like we have today, so they went across. And here's one layer in yellow. That's all sandstone. So there you can see North America, I think, pretty well. It's areas of white. There's no rocks today. So whether there was or not, probably wasn't. In some of these locations, it's very thin, almost non-existent down through this area, and that's important later. The West Coast didn't exist at the time. That was kind of added on as the flood progressed. More and more rocks were kind of shoved underneath North America, like, pushing a carpet underneath another carpet and leaving behind some of the dirt. And so eventually California and the West Coast was kind of smeared on. And so the geology out there is really very complex because of that. But this area up in Canada, I think, was high and dry because it was higher elevation along with Greenland. But this, you can see this blanket sand, which is still a very difficult phenomena for the secular world to explain. How do you get the same sandstone from areas, up here in the maritime provinces all the way down to Texas and Michigan, all the way across the American West, and basically covering almost all the 48 contiguous U.S. states. And in many cases, it's just a few, 10 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet thick. So to explain that much, they have to say, over millions of years, the same exact thing happened and moved all across the United States. But, even to them is kind of still not, doesn't seem quite right. And we believe it's explained better by one big deposition, one big layer, like a tsunami wave that washed in and spread around as you went along. And you can go to Michigan, my home state here, and see the pictured rocks on the left. And you can go to Grand Canyon, where I'll be on Tuesday, and I'll be looking at the Tapete sandstone. These are the same age sandstones, that same part of that same yellow sandstone across the United States. And this sandstone actually continues across in many other continents as well at the same time. You go to Jordan, you can go to Petra. It's the same sandstone at Petra, Jordan, as you see, across much of the United States at the same time. And you move up a couple of sequences to this yellow blanket layer, this big, or yellow, blue, sorry, this blue layer. And this blue layer represents limestone. So the yellow is sandstone, blue is limestone. But now we see a limestone that covers almost the same terrain as we saw that blanket sandstone. So we get almost a blanket limestone that covers much of the U.S. And this is the Redwall limestone down here in Grand Canyon in this area, and it's the same limestone throughout. So again, how do you explain a limestone that covers much of the United States all at the same time, all at once? Very, very difficult for the secular scientists to explain. And if you look at the fossils in these layers, the first three chapters, 1, 2, and 3 here, we get almost all marine fossils. There's almost no land animals at all. We see in the Sauk, we see marine critters. Tippecanoe, we see marine critters. Kaskaskia, see marine critters. And you add them all up. You add up those first three layers in terms of the thickness. We see over 3 kilometers, 3 to 5 kilometers of sediment on the East Coast. So that's 2 or 3 miles to you and me. You see another 3 or so kilometers over here in the west. And it's very thin down the middle. These darker colors represent, or white represents no rock of those ages early in the flood, or very, very thin. And that's very significant. We'll talk about later. That's why we see dinosaurs aren't buried early in the flood, why we don't see a lot of mammals buried in the flood. It's just marine critters. So let's move on, and we'll kind of tie all that together, hopefully. Chapters 4 to 5, you've got, I'm thinking days 40 to day 150, and I'll talk here a bit why, and here's why. The Bible tells us in Genesis 7, the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills and the whole heaven were covered. And it goes on to say this was day 150, kind of implying this is day 150 of the flood. There's some debate on that for some people, whether the flood reached its peak earlier and stayed up that high, and then, but day 150 definitely was still a high point of the flood. And it talks, the water increased, waters prevailed, increased greatly. I think God's telling us quite clearly that the water got higher, got higher, got higher. And the water kept going up. Yeah, after 40 days, it still kept going higher. And he talks about how the ark started to float on day 40. And so I believe that's why I use that day 40 as kind of a key. And the Bible likes, 40 is a number God used a lot. 40 years and, 40 days of fasting and in the wilderness for Jesus. And so I think there's a significance to that 40, but that's when the ark starts to float. I think that's when things got really bad. Where if you weren't on the ark, now you're starting to see that things are going really bad. There's people that are now starting to regret that they didn't listen to Noah. And you got to remember that only 8 people got on the ark. There might have been 1 billion people on the earth in 1,600 years. You could easily have had over 1 billion people. And yet only 8 people believed God and got on the ark. And that door was open for years, the door to salvation for those people. They could have just walked through the door, and there's plenty more room on the ark. I think could have held 1,000 people probably on the ark, or at least hundreds of people. And God had Noah, I think, build it bigger than he needed, just because he wanted to give room for people. But today we have that same thing going on with Jesus. He's our door. He's the door to salvation. And yet, we try to tell people that they need to believe in Christ for salvation, and that's kind of the same idea they had in the days of Noah. We have to, show people that there's that open door to salvation. But in this case, it's not just physical salvation; it's eternal salvation. So Christ has opened that door. So the ark is kind of like Christ in some ways. He provides salvation, and now, of course, Jesus, God Himself, has offered Himself through His shed blood as the ultimate salvation for all of us. But the Absarica was when things started to go really bad, I think, and the ark starts to float. And the thickness of the Absarica, this is a thickness map, it's 3 kilometers or so thick in mostly the southwest. So it comes in from a different direction, because now we're subducting and the plate tectonic activity is happening on the west coast. So if that's not a familiar term for it, just go with it. You're starting to make a new ocean crust now at this point, and you're shoving it underneath North America, and so you're bringing in rocks more from the west than you were from kind of the east and earlier on. And the whole new ocean crust, John Baumgartner talks about this. This is when the ocean turned over and created a whole new crust very, very quickly. This blue areas on this map are the oldest up against the continents. And as you make more seafloor, it splits in those red areas kind of equally on both sides. And you'll see in the Atlantic particularly, you can see the symmetry is the same, the green and the red. they match up. So they would have been together at one point in the past, the blue to blue and the green to green, but you keep making more crust, you keep pushing the continents further and further apart. And this all happened pretty much in that Absarica, or that fourth sequence in. There's no ocean crust today that is older than the Absarica. And it's a mystery to the secular science why the continents are, appear to be much older than the ocean crust. The ocean crust is fairly young. But we believe it happened in the flood. And the splitting of the continents, ultimately moved them around. You can see how they still fit today quite well, and they really did happen. And you see these big sand waves, evidence these huge sand waves that secular scientists try to say are from wind sand dunes, but they don't match the right angles to be wind-blown sand, and they often have marine minerals in them that are only found in ocean waters. So when you look at the real details, these do not support the secular story. When you go to Zion National Park, for example, they tell you these are from what dry sand dunes, but in fact the evidence inside and the size of the minerals and things indicates these are water waves. And you see these huge coal beds like in Wyoming, they're 85 foot thick, some of them 200 foot thick, which they have no way to explain any of these. I took a class at University of Wyoming working on my master's, and we went up to a field trip up to Powder River Basin in northeast Wyoming, and my advisor, he's a secular guy, didn't believe in God at all. He actually bashes creationists now. But he said we have nothing to explain this. There's no swamp model that can explain coal seams that are 100, 200 foot thick. And so the flood is the best explanation for these coal beds. So we're moving on to the next sequence up, which is now 5. And this is, I believe, the high point of the flood. And this map is fairly significant because it shows a couple of dots up here in Hudson Bay area, which were just discovered by oil wells that were drilled and outcrops. And I like to refer to these as the bathtub ring, where these oil, the sediments that came across here had to leave these remnants behind. And so there was more extensive, I'm only mapping what's there. So if the mountains pop through like here and here later and it erodes away, these areas are white, or, things that were eroded even after the flood. Here we have very little sediment. I believe this is the highest hills in the pre-flood world. And the Bible tells us that only went 15 cubits over the highest hills. And 15 cubits is maybe around 20, low 20s in terms of number of feet. So you don't leave a lot of sediment behind if you only have, 22 feet of water going over the top. So you didn't leave a lot of sediment behind in areas like Canada. But there's a few little remnants, which I think are very, very significant and neglected by the secular world. When you look at the fossils in the Absarica and Zunia, we see we are flooding the land now. Because suddenly we have land animals mixed with marine critters, land animals mixed with marine critters. And that's why I believe that this has to be at least day 40 of the flood. When the ark is floating, you're now flooding the land. So that's kind of why I tied to the Absarica. And if you look at, this is from the secular database, so the paleobiology database it's called. Former colleague of mine plotted these up for me. In blue is all the marine critters. And you see blue at the bottom goes 100% marine critters from Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia. The first 3 sequences are almost all marine, 99.9% marine critters. And as you work your way up higher, this is the Absarica, starts in the upper Carboniferous, you see more and more red as you go up, and those are the terrestrial animals. But you still see a lot of blue, more blue than red, in fact. And so there is all this mixing going on between marine animals and land animals. And the data really shows it. This is, you can go to the database online and do this yourself, plot up all these different animal phyla, and you can see which ones are terrestrial and which ones are aquatic. See that they're almost, it isn't that we evolved from marine critters. That's just what was being buried first, as we'll see. So in the Absarica, we see land animals, we see marine critters washed all the way up to Montana. These tsunami waves wash things away. We see coal, we see land plants, the first land plants, the first coal seams. The first land animals all show up in the Absarica. And then the Zunia, that continues, different types of animals, because you're going higher and higher in elevation, you get different critters. And so the dinosaurs even change a little bit from the lower levels to the higher levels. But you might wonder at this point, how did the dinosaurs survive the early flood? And they probably swam for a while as the water waves kept coming in, getting higher and higher, like you see here. But if you remember, they Sauk through Kaskaskia, those 1 through 3 chapters were very thin down the middle of the United States. And you see this in other continents as well, the same sort of pattern. And you find most of our dinosaurs are found, and footprints are found, kind of straddling that thin zone down the middle of the United States here. And so I kind of took my data and I said, let's draw the 400 or 500 meter line. Boom. And so we took the raw data and drew 400 meters or 500 meters. He said this area appears to have been dry land early in the flood. And then this area, which is even higher, Canada, which just those little remnants up there, was probably the highest ground in the pre-flood world for at least North America. And these other areas like my home state of Michigan and Indiana and those areas where you just find marine critters was probably some sort of a shelf or shallow sea. At the time, before the flood, maybe only a few hundred feet deep. So you had all these marine critters being deposited and buried. Early in the flood, you're mostly only burying those things, bringing in sediment and burying the marine critters, washing them around. And then later in the flood, you started doing the Dinosaur Peninsula. And so early on, you just get marine critters. So there's no dinosaurs in the Midwest. They're just marine fossils. You go to the Rockies and those areas, you see dinosaurs mixed with marine critters. And if you were to find fossils in Canada, you would have found probably most of the mammals and probably where the humans were living, higher elevations. We don't find dinosaurs with camels and horses. Those are all above the dinosaurs because I believe they were higher elevation and got washed on top of the dinosaurs as it came down. So it's been stripped right down to the crust. The Bible talks about he wiped them off the earth. He stripped it right down to the crust where I think the humans and most of our common mammals lived with the humans, like cattle and things. They were stripped right off and deposited all over the earth on top of the dinosaur rocks in many cases. So you kind of have this paleo, ecology, I guess. It's an old idea from Harold Coffin. Where early on the flood, you just deposited marine critters as the waters were starting to get higher. You started flooding the land around day 40. You start flooding the dinosaurs in the swampy areas, and then you went higher yet. To day 150, you finally went over the top and wiped out all the mammals and probably where the humans were living. So humans and dinosaurs probably lived in separate areas. They just, same time, just separate areas. Just like the mammals, most of the big mammals anyway, and the dinosaurs. Then finally the water went down. God remembered Noah, and the receding water phase began around day 150 as the ark touched ground. Then you have the almost another 160 days or so of receding water. God made a wind to pass over the earth, he says in the King James, the waters assuaged. Fountains of the deep, windows of heaven were stopped, rain from heaven was restrained, waters returned from off the earth continually. And at the end of 150 days, the waters were abated, so the water started going down. And the water originally was probably in the oceans. There was some water added from the fountains, but most of it was as you make new crust, it gets hot, and it pushes up the ocean from below. And so as you made more ocean crust, we talked about starting the Basilica and Zuni, the more ocean crust you made, the higher the water went, because you're pushing the bottom of your bathtub up. Well, eventually, as you make more and more crust, the older crust starts to cool, and as it cools, it sinks. Just like a hot air balloon losing its heat, and it starts to sink, and the crust of the earth, the ocean crust starts to subside. So the deepest oceans are these old areas now, way over here by the Marianas Trench in the Pacific, and it's still fairly shallow along these mid-ocean ridges. They're ridges because that's where there's still some residual magma still coming up. But during the flood, this would have happened much more quickly. So as enough of the ocean was starting to cool, it was pulling off the water off the land. So most of the water that was covering the land actually went back into the oceans. So it started in the oceans, added a little bit with the fountains, and then went back to the oceans as the oceans sank by cooling. And so here's the Tejas, where all the water went, is mostly offshore. You have most of the world's mountains pop up at this time. As a consequence of all that runaway rapid subduction, you thicken the crust, and John Baumgartner can give you more details on this, but it actually causes if it's thick crust, it's going to push higher. So 80% of the world's mountains form. The Himalayas, the Rockies, the Andes, all form at this time late in the flood as the water is receding, draining off the land. So you get a lot of the tops of these mountains were kind of eroded off and left a lot of sediment around the American West. You get the Cascades erupting, Mount St. Helens, forming the mountain that it is today. Most of that began the Tejas. Yellowstone's eruptions all happened at this time. The supervolcano erupted at this time. But again, God still had Noah and everybody still in the ark, hence they were still protected by the ark. And most of these sediments in this area of the world, in North America, drained off into the Gulf, and that becomes our oil sediments, oil-filled sediments in the Gulf that we look for oil And they're still finding huge deposits in the Gulf. And these fossils mostly found in the Tejas, the receding phase, are mostly marine fossils, of course, again, and mammals. So we see these large mammals and marine mix going on like we saw before. And here's kind of how it worked across South America. We talked about North America a lot. Here's the Sauk, the first sequence in South America. And you can see how the flood progresses greater and greater, just like the Bible talks about. So here's the Sauk, Tippecanoe, the Kaskaskia. You see it's increasing the coverage. The blue's getting wider. The Absarica, you see even more. The Zuni, this is the high point of the flood, I believe, for most of the continents. And then you see it receding. And here you see the Andes pop up in the middle. And so it's white here because they wrote off all the sediments. But you see it gets thick off the Amazon. More water is draining off than going on. So we can go through that again really quick because some of you blinked. But this is the first, chapter, second, third, fourth, fifth, the high point of the flood, and then the receding phase is the way I see it. So if you look at the start of the flood, there's the Sauk thickness across the continents I have done. I don't have Asia done in Australia or Antarctica, but this is the beginning of the flood. There's a lot more coverage in North America than most of the continents, but you'll see the consistency in the first few sequences. So this is the start of the flood, and this is the high point of the flood. You can see how much more dramatic the coverage, the start of the flood to the high point of the flood. And even those little remnants up in North America and across Africa, you see those little bathtub ring pieces. So even though this was probably a lot of these areas in white, like the Scandinavia area, were probably high points before the flood, it actually does show that there was, some sediment across those little areas. And this is the receding phase, when most of the material is going offshore again. As the water drained, you dumped these green areas are very thick, like in the Gulf of Mexico and off the Niger Delta. Over here, and actually the South Caspian Sea is tremendously thick. It's over about 9 miles thick of just this receding phase sediments. And so in Europe, again, if you look at just Europe, I just finished up, we have the same sort of pattern. This first frame over here on the left shows the Sauk, the beginning of the flood, which is probably a shallow sea area. And then you see the high point of the flood, the Zuni, where a lot more of the continent is flooded except for this area, Norway, still very, very thin. And then you see the receding phase kind of mimics the high point, but it's shifted more offshore in most cases. So this is a summary of the four continents I have done. Here's North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and then there's a total of all four. It shows by sequence. The first sequence is in green, the Sauk, and this is the Zuni at the end. But the high point of the flood is this brown one. And you see only in Europe do you see a little earlier flooding because Europe seems to be more of a shallow sea and more of a lowland. There wasn't very many uplands in Europe, so you get a little bit higher flooding a little earlier than most of the continents. But at the end, this is the surface area that's still there today. You can still see it's the minimum amount early, a little bit more, greater, and then you reach the peak, and then it's going down. And that's reflected also in the volume of sediment. That was surface area. This is volume. You see North America. You see kind of a steady increase in volume. Actually, there's more receding sediment than there is even at the high point. South America, same sort of thing. Africa really peaks in the Zuni. Because Africa doesn't have any Andes or Rockies to get in the way. It just shows, what the sediments really do show. Europe, again, peaks a little bit earlier in the Absarica because much more of Europe, I believe, was not uplands, but it was lowlands. So when you add all four of them up again, you get a nice pattern of starting slow, increasing, peaking, and then going down. So to me, this is compelling. Pretty much all the continents are doing the same thing. So to argue that's not a global flood is, to me, you're arguing against the facts. The facts show that there was one increase in flooding, started out slow, built to a peak. In most continents, it was in the Zuni, the end of the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs are buried, and then you went over the top and through the water started to recede, you threw the mammals kind of on top of all that. But the pattern, the rocks themselves don't lie. Only people lie. The rocks show there was a global flood. Here's North America, again, by rock type. This is the volume by rock type. So the brown is shale, blue is limestone, yellow is sandstone, red is volcanics. And we see at the end there, the volcanics are peaking. This is part of Yellowstone, the Cascades, all those super volcanoes that people seem to worry about. Well, that happened in the flood. So I don't believe you're going to get super volcano eruptions anymore. Those are just like the rapid movement of the plates aren't going to happen anymore. We have very slow movements and very small eruptions compared to what we had in the past. Here's Africa, here's South America, here's Europe, and here's the world totals again by rock type. So again, brownish shale. So you do see that shale is the most common sedimentary rock, which geologists have said for years, but it's nice to see that confirmed when I push a button on the computer, totals up all my 2,000 and some columns, and you get the results. You know, a lot of carbonate, limestone, and in blue, and then you get quite a bit of sandstone in yellow. And there's even a lot of salt. This kind of pinkish color is salt. So you get salt kind of flows out, and salt we think is probably due to the fountains. Heavily salty, almost these really weird chemistries coming out of the fountains, and they're often found in areas where the earth rifted a little bit. But to me, this is the global pattern we see. Starts out slow, works its way up, peaks, and goes down. And so I redrew the sea level curve that we always see in the geology textbooks. They always draw a big peak down here early on, but that doesn't show up. And I'm going to be giving a talk next month at the Geological Society of America meeting in Phoenix. I'm going to give a talk on the Sauk and Tippecanoe sequences, how they didn't actually flood as much as we have been telling our students. The rocks across the continents don't really support that. They show very little flooding, and then, of course, maximum flooding up here. So this, to me, is in my book. It's going to be in my book coming out this fall. It's going to put a lot of these maps, sequence by sequence. You can go through it and see it all. And ultimately, we can take our maps and we can start constructing basic pre-flood world maps. And this is kind of putting it all back together into kind of a Pangea. The light green are the highest areas that were flooded last. So that's probably where humans and most mammals were living in the pre-flood world. And then you see that the darker green are like the Dinosaur Peninsula, the kind of lowland areas. And much of Europe up here is a lowland. We actually haven't updated it here, but we predicted this based on the rocks we saw, and then we went back and verified it. When we put our data in, we didn't have to change much. We actually did a pretty good job of kind of guesstimating what Europe was, and sure enough, it was mostly a lowland. And that's why it flooded a little bit earlier than, say, Africa and South America and even North America, because it was lower ground. But you notice it's separated here. We have a landmass here. These are stretched in the north, and a landmass over here that may have been separate from this bigger landmass down here. So it's possible the guy did create, one big landmass with a couple smaller ones that were separated by some water. Put Adam and Eve here, for example, somewhere. We don't know where Eden is, but somewhere down in this area, and then put animals that maybe on every continent. And then the humans finally had to take some boats, use their technology, use their intelligence that God gave us to actually get across these other areas. I don't know if it's true or not, but this seems to be what the rocks are starting to show. So don't hold me to it, but that's our best guess at this point. So what we did is we put all this on a globe. We had a guy come in and color it all. We put it on a 48-inch globe. You'll be able to see this 2-minute video that shows up. And it looks better on a globe than a flat screen because it isn't stretched at the top. But here's kind of North America, South America, Africa, and this is Antarctica and Australia kind of stuck on. And Europe's up here, and then Asia's kind of back over in this way. And there's some debate about that, but you can kind of see these white areas are the fountains that burst on day one. So they're supposed to be showing steam and things coming out, making the plates, initial plate boundaries. And then as it progressed along to day 25, the water's coming in, making things muddier as you work your way in. Day 40, you're looking at, it's flooding more and more of the land. So like the Bible talks about, the ark starts to float on day 40. And based on our sequences, and you can see the continents are starting to move apart a little bit under the water. Now North America over here in day 90 and a little bit of Africa. Just the highest ground is above the sea level at this point. This is probably where the humans and most of the mammals were. And eventually those start to flood as well, and people are, I'm sure, panicking at this point in the flood. Day 130, there probably wasn't much left. By day 150, you have this. All you have is the ark, and the people on the ark, and the animals on the ark, 2 of every kind, including the dinosaurs. There's only about 60 kinds of dinosaurs, so you only need about 130 dinosaurs, 120 dinosaurs maybe. But this is, to me, when you see this on the globe, it's very compelling. It's just all blue. And then by day 250 or so, you're starting to get the land coming back. Most of the mountainous areas popping up first. Over to the right over here, this would be the Alps. The ark would have landed somewhere over here, probably in the Himalayas are over here, but there's that big mountain chain that runs from the Alps to the Himalayas, and here you got the Rockies all the way down to the Andes, and then eventually more and more land shows up, And there's no vegetation on them quite yet. And you get more day 314 when the world was pretty much dry. And then it starts to green up. And then that's when God finally opens the door and says, you guys can go now. And there's enough food for you, for the animals to eat. So the flood was global. I told you I'd spend more time on that than anything else. And some of you are asleep now, but try to get some coffee in. We're going to go through the next part kind of quick. But it was catastrophic as well, as we'll see, and it was recent. So let's go to catastrophic. When I dig dinosaurs, I used to dig in Thermopolis, Wyoming. You find these bone beds. So when you find bones, you find hundreds or thousands of bones, usually all packed together like log jams. It's not just a single bone. It looks like literally like log jams of bones of different animals all tore apart. And when you find marine fossils mixed with them, we find land plants mixed with, swimming critters. We find dinosaurs like this on top of fish. You see evidence of rapid sedimentation. You see polystrate trees occasionally standing up. These layers didn't take thousands of years to be deposited because the tree would have rotted away. And so it had to be a rapid deposition. You see immediate death positions, animals that were still alive, eating things just buried instantly. Yeah, so dinosaurs themselves were buried rapidly as well. It wasn't a slow process. And here's proof of that. My favorite specimen that ever was found by a Polish expedition to Mongolia found a velociraptor, which really isn't that big. The movies lie. And Protoceratops here, and they're actually in the process of fighting. The arm of the velociraptor is in the mouth of the Protoceratops, who's a plant-eating animal, but it was, like a trapped rat. It's going to bite back. And so it was biting down on the velociraptor, about to snap its arm with a really strong bite, and then they got buried instantly in the flood, just like we just saw in the last video clip. And you'll see mummified dinosaurs with the skin still on them. No evidence of feathers, by the way. That's another whole talk I could give later. But there's a lot of creation scientists saying there's feathered dinosaurs, and I think that's not correct. I think they're looking at feathered birds, and they're calling them feathered dinosaurs because the secular scientists have expanded the definition of what a dinosaur is to include birds because they want them to evolve into birds. And so they're, unfortunately, a lot of creation paleontologists are actually buying into that lie. When you look at the anatomy of these things, their legs, they walk like birds, unlike dinosaurs. And so there's a difference between the two. But we see flat planar deposits all across the world. You can go out to Colorado and places, or Grand Canyon, you can see these same layers go for miles in all directions. There's no evidence of erosion. There's no gullies, no river valleys cut into these. They're pretty much flat on flat on flat, just like bricks. We see there's supposed to be close to 1 million years of erosion here between the Coconino sandstone on the top and the Hermit Shale underneath. You go around Grand Canyon and you see it's perfectly flat. This is a shale, a very soft rock made out of clay. You got a sandstone coming across. Why wouldn't there be some sort of gullies and erosional surfaces? And you see this everywhere you go, flat upon flat upon flat. Occasionally there's some erosion here and there, but very little compared to, layer upon layer. It's almost like you're putting bricks on. There's no time between these bricks either. There's no significant amount of time. You may have a few days or a few weeks between some of the layers. But there's no evidence of great time. So let's move on to the final point, because some of you are dozing off. I hope not. One or two of you might be. Let's go back to the bones. What do the rocks really show? And the rocks are showing this. Since 2005, we've discovered Mary Schweitzer's initial discovery of soft tissues, original proteins, soft things. This is like a rubber band. She's able to stretch it in video. There's original proteins and cells, red blood cells, red osteocyte cells, bone-making cells. And there was just a new paper that came out a couple of days ago, finding another one of these. And there's been over 100 papers now since her discovery in 2005, secular papers showing original proteins, collagens, all these different cells, blood vessels have been found over and over and over, showing that these things are still, like, not that old, because physical chemists have shown that collagen, which is one of the more durable proteins, it makes up, leather and our leather shoes and things. That's one of the more durable proteins. That can't even last more than, a couple 100,000 years, less than 1 million years. And there's been more studies now. There's my colleague here at ICR, Brian Thomas, is working on a study showing that some of these proteins can't even last anywhere near that long. They're doing some new empirical studies showing the decay rates of these proteins. So when you look at these dinosaur bones, they tell you they're 68 million years old or 150 million years old. They're just telling you that based on their age dates, which are all based on assumptions. They can't be verified, but yet the the fossils themselves are screaming young. They're showing these proteins, these cells, things that can't be that old. But you might say, but Tim, there's just 100 or so papers, and there's 6 new ones every year that they keep finding more and more. I imagine you have enough original tissues and proteins to fill a barrel. Enough would millions of barrels convince you that the world can't be that old? The flood wasn't that long ago. Well, oil is organic tissue. So all the oil deposits out there in the world, when I worked for Chevron, they told me the oil in Wyoming is 150 million years old. And it's just sitting there waiting for us to drill into and put it in our cars. I'm like, it can't be. The oil's there. It's there, sure, but it can't be that old. Most oil actually is biodegraded. Most oil we produce is either heavily or partially biodegraded. So oil is really not that old. Oil is found from original, organic compounds from marine algae. And so they've actually taken marine algae in our government labs and made oil in less than an hour. So we tie it to these rocks where they're fracking into those rocks. Now, if oil is really old and produced millions of years ago, they should be fracking these rocks. There should be nothing there. This should have all been produced, should have all been generated. There should be nothing left. And then the oil can't just sit around. There's bacteria everywhere. Everywhere we've drilled, as deep as we've drilled, there's bacteria. And even though it's slower underground without the oxygen, there's still anaerobic bacteria that still eats oil. And that's why most of the oil today we do produce is biodegraded. The tar sands, for example, in Alberta are heavily biodegraded. That's why they're tar. But even that will go away. If you remember the spill, the BP spill in the Gulf, most of that was eaten up by bacteria. And so if you expose it to the atmosphere, of course, it degrades even faster. But it's amazing to me we have any oil, because all the oil should be biodegrading. But I think some of it's still generating. So there's a lot of evidence that the flood was global. And the research I'm doing is showing the flood really was a global event that affected every continent pretty much at the same time, the same levels everywhere. Starts so slow on all the continents, builds up to a higher point, reaches a peak, and then it all goes down all at the same time. So whatever was going on, it was truly global. And it was catastrophic. We see the burial in the fossils, these catastrophic events, burying animals while they're still alive, in life position. And then finally, evidence in the rocks themselves are showing the flood was recent. And yet most of this information, because it goes against evolutionary theory, is being suppressed. It's not being talked about even in the secular community. They might talk about chemical fossils now, but they don't talk about the significance of those chemical fossils. They can't be that old. And my research in the global flood hasn't been done in over 60, 50, 60 years. And there's a lot more data now. There's a lot more offshore drilling. And so what I'm seeing is really never been done. And so I'm having the best time of my life. ICR's paying my bills while I do this greatest research, I think, in the world that shows God's word is true. There really was a flood. And Dr. John, my colleague here, who comes in, he's retired, but he comes in about once a week. He wrote this book before he retired on the global flood. And he talks about these mega sequences at the end. And my book's going to kind of take over where his book left off and show, okay, here he defines everything. But this book's available at ICR today. You can get that. And a similar version of this talk you can buy on our website as well. This is the shorter version. It's only 40 minutes, The Truth of the Genesis Flood. It's pretty well done, I guess. I didn't watch it. I don't like to watch myself. It's one of those things where if I made movies, I wouldn't watch my own movies. I'm like, yeah, but apparently some of the guys that worked, that was pretty good. So if you want to hear this again, which sometimes it takes 2 or 3 times for some of this to soak in, you can watch it again. And those video clips I showed you are all from this 4-part DVD series we put out a few years ago. I took some of those clips of the dinosaurs swimming. We spent about $1 million on these 4 videos and did a really good job on the computer animations and the talks. And so this is also available on our website. I think it's like $40, $39. You can get it on sale once in a while, but it's well worth it. Each one of those is about 22 minutes long. And then my wife and I had a lot of fun. We actually have 2 more in the works, but this is our first children's book that we wrote about Henry, the hadrosaur. He's in the middle there. And here's his 2 sisters, because you can tell because they have eyelashes, so they're obviously girls. That's how you can tell, which those aren't preserved in the fossils yet, so we don't really know. We can't tell male and female dinosaurs very well, except in a few cases, which is another story. But anyway, he grows up God kind of brings him to the ark. And that's kind of, he finds out his plan that God had for him was he was one of the 2 hadrosaur dinosaurs or duck-billed dinosaurs chosen for the ark. but it's kind of a story. My wife was a kindergarten teacher for many years, and she was at a Christian school for part of that time, and she had to keep crossing out the millions of years, the felt marker, and because all the books talk about millions of years and evolution. So we wanted to write a book finally. We have two more in the works that talk about. It's a story you can read your kids. It's like 30 pages long, really well illustrated, and it's not just facts. It's actually a little story. So it's for the young, kids 4 to 7. But it's turned out pretty better than we thought, I think, in some ways. So God's hand was in some of these things. And then my dinosaur book, which talks a little bit about the North American database that I talked about in my talk you guys just endured. This is kind of shows how dinosaurs fit. I used to teach a dinosaur class at a public college for many years, and I was able to put it into this book and tie it to the Bible and how dinosaurs fit on the ark. And that's another talk in itself in my dinosaur talk. But it also shows how they fit in the rock record at the end, why they're found, not in Michigan, but they're found in Colorado. And that's because of that dinosaur peninsula idea that the rocks really do show that there was a progressive flood. It flooded their lowest areas first, and the higher areas, and the highest areas last. And it all kind of makes sense. And that's kind of what my new book coming out on the flood's going to say at the end, the last chapter, is it all makes sense. Because it all kind of ties together, and it all shows that God's word is really true. Everything God says is true. And science really just support it. And this is a book written by all the science staff just before I showed up at ICR 6 years ago, which covers a lot more topics. It covers some of the gap theory, the day-age theory from the theological side, and it talks about astronomy, the evidence of a young universe. It talks about biology, how we're not 98% like chimps. We're more like 80% like chimps when you look at the whole genome. And then also some of the geology in here. Even the dinosaur soft tissue stuff is in here. And so this book is a steal of a deal. I make my college students. I teach at a gateway church up here, is a mega church, and they have a college that they acquired called the King's University in South Lake, Texas, over here on the other side of the airport. And we use this to supplement the secular text because it's they need students in the Christian schools need to hear the truth. And this is all the chapters in here are fairly short. And a few of my students have read this and said this is the best book they ever read. And it's wider than the Bible, obviously. But because it shows them in a short little chapters how there really is this strong evidence that Earth is young, just like the Bible says, and they can believe their Bible. And so for many of them, they've gone to Christian schools all their lives and they never heard any of this. And so we're trying to get the word out there. That's what ICR is all about, trying to get the word out that God's word is true and that science really does support it. So if any of you are supporting us, thank you, because we really appreciate the support. I wouldn't be able to do this research I'm doing without the support of thousands of people across the country who are giving money to ICR and gives me the time to do this type of research. But with that, I'll turn it over to any questions or turn it back over to Pastor Robbie. And I know it's a lot to swallow in 45 minutes or so, or maybe we're a little longer. I don't know. But anybody have any questions or comments, or anybody think I'm nuts? I hear that once in a while too.
Dr. Clarey.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Clarey, this is Rick White. Have any human fossils been found in the Tejas mega sequence?
Yeah, I believe they have. I mean, some of those, what they call Homo erectus, which I believe are probably fully human fossils. Some of those are found, I think, in the uppermost Tejas. This is the stuff just before the Pleistocene, which is the Ice Age. But most of the human fossils are Ice Age, but there's been a few. And I don't know if we've been looking in the right places is the problem. I think, we've that's where Steve Austin and I disagree a little bit. I think the flood boundary is higher. And John Baumgartner and I agree that it's got to be higher, probably the top of the Tejas for the end of the flood. And the high point of the flood was the Cretaceous, not the end of the flood, like many of my creation geology colleagues have been saying for years. But the data shows there's too much sediment still in the Tejas to be over and too much going on. And that's what I talked about in Wisconsin. But I think if we start looking at some of these big mammal fossils, and there's actually been a few bones, there's even been, I think, a toe bone of a human found in Miocene rocks. But the paper that published it said this has to be some extinct ape. I mean, even though our medical doctor on our staff, looked at the paper and he says that's a human toe bone. but they refused to believe that it could be human bones. They were torn apart in the Tejas, in the Miocene sediments. But there are some of the very upper layers, but there's very few humans. I think most humans, the reason there's not many human fossils, I think, is because they were buried last. Humans were sticking to the highest ground, maybe even trying to make little, boats and rafts at the last minute, but the waves are too big. They still drown anyway. The tsunami waves are going to come through and overturn them. And if you don't get buried deep, you don't become a fossil. And so if humans are buried last or buried very shallow, they're going to erode away. And there's been a lot of erosion in 4,500 years. The Ice Age came through and eroded a bunch of rock as well. And so I think a lot of the rocks that might have contained humans, they didn't become fossils just because they weren't buried deep enough. But I think if we start looking more on the upper Tejas layers, you really start looking, we may find more. But again, much of the Tejas is offshore, and it's hard to look offshore. We have found dinosaurs. I just wrote an article this last month in X and Facts about a dinosaur fossil found in an oil well core off Norway, 70 miles offshore, 1.5 miles deep. And so it's possible there's a lot of human fossils that just got washed out to sea as the floodwaters receded. So the problem is they weren't buried deep enough, number one, to become a fossil. And secondly, many of them were probably scattered and spread apart, ripped apart, and many of them washed into the ocean.
Okay, thank you.
Tim.
Okay.
This is Ralph.
Yeah, this is Ralph. I'm from Michigan too.
All right.
But I'm 71 now, and I'm in the Philippines, and your brain is slower here.
I understand.
Yeah, I read this. I know the answer to this, but I can't remember it. The continent split up at the flood. I can understand the fossils all over the place. But how did the animals that came off the ark, like kangaroos, how did they get to Australia? Was there land connections?
Yep. Yeah, see, that's what God had a plan. That's what I talk about in my book. The Ice Age came on as a consequence of the flood because you made all that new ocean crust, and the Ice Age lowered sea levels. And so God planned the flood to operate so that it would create an ice age after the flood, within a few hundred years after the flood. And that ice age lowered sea levels and opened up these land bridges for animals to migrate. Now, Australia, there was still a little bit of water. Didn't quite make a complete land bridge to Australia. And so I think that's one of the reasons why certain animals like the marsupials are able to survive in Australia and they didn't survive in other places. But the Ice Age is very, very important ending to the flood. It was brought on by the heating of the water from all that new seafloor, made the water very hot, a lot of evaporation, and then all the volcanoes like Yellowstone going off all over the world for hundreds of years. That peak in the Tejas we talked about of the volcanics, that put a lot of ash and aerosols in the atmosphere to cool the earth. So for hundreds of years you had warm water that was still cooling, causing a lot of evaporation, and in the north it came down as snow because the Earth's climate was cooler. So even the time of Job talks about, Henry Morris wrote a book about Job and commentary and talks about there's more references to snow and ice in the book of Job than any other book because he was probably living during the Ice Age, but he was south of where the ice was, but it was still probably cooler and a wetter climate in the Middle East even at that time. So the climates were a lot different probably for the first 1,000 years after the flood. But the Ice Age kind of came and went probably in about 500 to 700 years. But it did allow the timing, and was just perfect because God is perfect for the animals to walk from, Turkey, wherever they landed, across all these land bridges, and even almost to Australia. There was almost a complete land bridge there. But that was very, very important because, God had to have a plan to get them back. And the humans, of course, were disobeying, staying in the Tower of Babel area. So God had to confound the languages to get them to spread out, or they were going to miss that window of opportunity to walk across the Bering Sea to get to North America and South America, etc. Follow the animals as they went along. So anyway, and that's my phone ringing off the hook. Sure, shut it off. Sorry. But does that make any sense? I mean, the land bridges.
Yes, thank you.
Land bridges is the key.
So you're saying some of the animals survived the flood that were not on the ark?
No, they didn't. They were only in the marine realm. A lot of the marine animals, but no, they all were wiped off just like humans. If you weren't on the ark and you were a land, air-breathing animal that walked on land, you were dead by day 150. That's what the Bible says, and that's what it shows. But after the flood, when they got out the ark, they were able to spread out. Yeah, and a few hundred years after the flood, the ice age would have reached its peak, maybe 500 years afterwards, and that's when you had these land bridges. So the timing of getting from Ararat across, Siberia and the Bering Sea would maybe taken several hundred years, but God had the bridge there laid before him. It's like a temporary bridge, and then it disappeared. When the ice age went away, water rose to where we are today. And so there was a limited window of time for animals and humans to get across these from continent to continent.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Tim, I have a question. Does ICR have any videos or something we could show to young kids and perhaps teenagers?
Well, those videos like I showed, like that dinosaur one is actually really good. That 4-part video series, because it shows a lot of those animations, and they're short enough. They're only 20 minutes. We have a lot of, we didn't make those very long. But we try to put a lot of money into those. We have a 12-part DVD series too called Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis, which is kind of the title of my, the series that we did this in. But that's 12 videos. I think that one's closer to $100. But it's 12 20-minute videos, and we spent a couple $1 million putting that one together a couple years ago. Those are pretty good. They're DVDs. We're also putting out more and more little snippets, things you can watch on our website, and there's more those I don't know what the kids call them. I can't think of it now. I got to ask our millennials here on the staff where they do those little just a podcast. I guess they are just things you can listen to, just a few minutes, like a 2 or 3 minute podcast. We have a lot of those on our website as well. But in terms of videos, we've got our kind of these talks, but we also have the more entertaining ones for kids and teenagers are those, like the dinosaur, that 4-part DVD series. Those are actually probably the best things we have.